Hey guys, tonight we wander through time to witness the birth of civilization, tracing how nomadic bands transform into settled communities. You feel grit underfoot as dawn's light filters through slender reeds, the smell of wet clay rising from a half-built wall. And, fair warning, you probably won't survive this well. Not without tripping over a stray goat or accidentally inventing the first eyebrow-raising haircut. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe button. Only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments below so we can track where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge alongside a handful of early farmers, the first pioneers of what scholars call the Neolithic Revolution, which kicked off around 10,000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent. That shift from hunting and gathering into planting seeds is a mainstream historical fact tech appended every aspect of human life. Suddenly, wheat and barley weren't just wild grasses. They were commodities you could trade for pottery shards or a spare goat. Historians still argue whether climate change or sheer population pressure pushed people into fields. But either way, those first grain kernels became the currency of emerging societies. As you step into a clearing near a slow-moving river, you see crude mud brick huts huddled together. Communal ovens puff out wisps of smoke, and a few children chase each other around makeshift wooden posts. A fringe theory whispers that these huts once hosted communal sleep rituals designed to ward off bad harvest omens, participants wearing animal masks to summon fertility. You raise an eyebrow, imagining a goat-headed shaman chanting lullabies. Hard to know if that really happened, but it's a quirky tidbit that lingers in some dusty footnotes. You crouch by the fields, watching someone press a sharp flint blade into the ground. This tool is nothing fancy, just a chipped piece of stone butt. It represents a monumental leap. Human hands, deliberately crafting implements for farming rather than snagging wild plants on adrenaline-fueled hunts. The blade's edge glints in the sun, and you can almost taste the earth's iron-rich temps in the air. You swear it smells better than curbside trash. But hey, ancient nostalgia has its perks. Nearby, a group of women, no more than a dozen villagers, knead clay into small figurines. You step closer and notice painted eyes staring back. They're fertility idols, or so some say, used in seasonal ceremonies. Another debate swirls. Historians still argue whether these figurines were worshipped as deities or simply served as children's playthings. You imagine a toddler accidentally launching its favorite goddess across a courtyard divine. Sacrilege by spitball. The sense of communal purpose here is electric. Everyone has a role, tending goats, weaving reed baskets, or grinding grain between large stones powered by foot. You catch a whiff of recently harvested lentils roasting by the hearth and realize that smells like progress. If you think your office coffee machine is fancy, try a communal stone mill that squeaks louder than a toddler on a sugar rush. 3 light jokes later, you're already missing your instant espresso by mid-morning. A small gathering forms around a rough-hewn wooden table where someone places a freshly baked flatbread studded with sesame seeds. It's passing it around, villagers. Trade stories of which fields yielded the best barley that season. You bite into it and wonder why anyone ever went back to foraging. Settling down here feels like hitting civilization's easy mode, no more chasing woolly mammoths, just weekly maintenance of irrigation ditches, yet the flip side emerges soon enough. Walls go up thicker to keep out wandering bandits, and new hierarchies form. Elders adjudicate disputes, warriors patrol the perimeters, and informal taxes begin in the form of grain tithes. You feel the shift from egalitarian camps to structured polities and a quiet tension hovers in the air. After all, when you owe the chief 10 baskets of barley, you're not exactly on equal footing anymore. Somewhere in the shade, an elder scribbles tally marks on a clay tablet, proto-counting at its finest. That same method would eventually evolve into cuneiform script, but for now, it's just scratched lines reminiscent of bored school kids doodling on desks. One fringe story suggests that the first writing was invented to keep track of beer rations. You snort. Beer rationing sounds like ancient happy hour. All the while, you bask in the sense that this settlement is riding an unstoppable wave. But if you pause to listen, its faint creaks and groans echo from the tallest structure, primitive granary, whose weight could collapse unstable foundations. It's a foreshadowing drum roll you're too busy marveling at to fully register. Civilization. It is stirring from its long slumber, but the tremors beneath the surface are already writing a story of tension, growth, and eventual rupture. You step out of that sun-baked granary vision and find yourself by a wide, lazy river, its banks lined with papyrus reeds whispering in the morning breeze. Here, water isn't just water, it's the lifeblood pulsing through entire civilizations. You sink your toes into damp silt, and it feels as rich as any black velvet cushion you've ever sunk into at home. Remember that goat-headed shaman from last time? This place makes even that look tamed at first. You glide along the Nile, Egypt's great artery. Around 3000 BCE, farmers stand knee-deep in flooded furrows, casting seed into the ooze. Thanks to seasonal inundations, those fields thrive with wheat and flax, turning barren desert into a patchwork quilt of green and gold every year. That predictable flooding is a mainstream fact that kickstarts a stable food surplus and funds grand projects like pyramids that later puncture the skyline. You can practically hear the chisels and see limestone blocks being hauled up ramps. A monumental vision born of those early riverbank harvests. A playful fringe theory claims early Egyptians smeared crocodile dung on their noses, both as sunscreen and as a secret aphrodisiac. You wrinkle your nose, picturing someone applying slimy dung before a date. Now there's romantic evening plans gone wrong. Historians still argue whether such practices were widespread or mere gossip whispered among scribes. Gliding eastward, you drift into Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates. Here, in the cradle of Sumer, around 3500 BCE. The first cities unfurl like lotus blossoms. Suruk, Eridu, and Ur. Brick temples soar above packed clay streets. You taste the dry, spicy Thames of date syrup as a street vendor offers samples, reminding you that ancient candy bars weren't too shabby. You nibble thoughtfully, surprised at how good caramelized fruit can be when you're not chasing wild goats. In Uruk's marketplace, you overhear debate among traders. One swears that baked bricks carved with cuneiform tablets record grain shipments, while another insists they actually chronicled the first love letters. Historians still argue whether those early inscriptions primarily tracked commerce or personal affairs. But either way, you'd pay to see an ancient Tinder message scratched onto clay. Floating south, you cross into the Indus Valley around 2500 BCE, where Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa rise on leveled platforms. You wander broad, straight streets flanked by two-story houses, each equipped with a private bathroom connected to covered drains. Blink, and you'd think you're in a futuristic spa. That urban planning is a mainstream marvel, showing these people mastered civil engineering long before skyscrapers. You dip your hand into a small well and feel the cool water against your skin, as soothing as any modern-day spa fountain. Quirky tidbit emerges from an excavation report. Archaeologists found evidence that Indus residents rinsed their teeth with twigs coated in powdered burnt cowbone as toothpaste. You can practically hear them scrubbing in communal courtyards. A prehistoric dental hygiene party complete with gossip about neighbors' morning breath. Historians still argue whether those twigs doubled as perfumed, cue sticks, or purely utilitarian tools. Across all three regions, Q noticed shared innovation: pottery wheels spinning clay into vessels, simple looms weaving cotton and wool into garments, and rudimentary metallurgy honing copper into sickles. You pause to imagine yourself as a potter's apprentice, your fingers slick with wet clay as you shape the evening's dinner bowls. 3 light jokes float to mind if you drop. 1. You'll have to invent pottery insurance. If it cracks, you might accidentally discover trapezoids. And if it turns out perfect, you'll forever be known as that overachieving mud mixer. These river valleys also fostered early governance. You hear the echo of public gatherings where village elders debate water-sharing rights. In the Nile Delta, a local leader enforces corvée labor, drafting farmers for canal maintenance. In Mesopotamia, city-states wage seasonal skirmishes over irrigation rights, creating a tapestry of shifting borders. In the Indus, some scholars suggest central authorities may have managed standardized weights and measures, but historians still argue whether that implied a singular empire or a loose confederation of city leagues at the water's edge. Fishermen haul in baskets teeming with fish barbel, catfish, and carp. You taste a fresh catch, lightly salted and grilled over reeds, and the smoky sweetness lingers on your tongue. It's a reminder that rivers not only irrigated fields, but also stocked dinner plates. A rare fringe idea proposes that these anglers used early fish farms' little pens in calm river cough stew, fattened carp in controlled conditions. You squint, picturing tiny carp wearing fish-sized life jackets, can laugh at how even ancient people might have tinkered with aquaculture. As you stand, the sun beginning its climb, you watch a merchant caravan prepare to depart along a dusty road flanked by date palms. Goods will travel hundreds of miles, lazily from distant mountains. It's tin from Anatolian mines. It's perhaps even beads from the Indus. That long-distance commerce is a mainstream truth, showing that globalization started with camel caravans and wooden boats. You snort, imagining someone sending the first ancient postcard reading. Having a blast, wish you were here at the river festival. Signed, your friendly caravan driver. With each valley, you sense a rhythm. Flood, plant, harvest, trade. Celebrate, rebuild. You feel cooling breezes off the water as you trace canceled cuneiform tablets and sun-bleached Indus seals. Remember that sense of communal ovens puffing smoke back in the Fertile Crescent? Here, you see it multiplied across 3 mighty river systems, each birthing its own style of civilization. Though separated by deserts and mountains, these cultures share an intimate bond with running water. You inhale the moisture-laden air one last time before drifting onward. Carrying this tableau of agrarian abundance, urban brilliance, and early statecraft, beneath it all hums the knowledge that wherever humans cluster around hallowed rivers, innovation surges like whitewater rapids, transforming muddy banks into dazzling citadels. Yet even here, those tremors of tension you glimpsed in section 1 still reverberate. Water disputes, social stratification, and ecological strain lurk beneath the shimmer of prosperity. And so, as you step away from these cradle sites, you carry both their promise and their peril, ready to follow the rivers course further into the story of civilization's rise and eventual unraveling. You step away from those bustling city-states and riverbank revelries into a land where the sky grows ominously pale and the earth crackles beneath your feet. You squint at distant hills that once crowned verdant fields, now reduced to parched dust bowls. It's as if the world hit pause on rainfall. You find yourself wandering through a theatrical set for a play called Civilization Under Stress. The wind gusts up loose sand and you tuck your tunic tighter, realizing that sometimes the biggest threat to society isn't swords or invaders, but nature itself. Around 2200 BCE, a major drought known today as the 4.2 kilo-year event sweeps through Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Basin, shrinking rivers and shriveling crops. This is a mainstream historical fact. Tree ring data and sediment cores show a sharp drop in precipitation that lasted centuries, squeezing the agrarian foundations of crowded cities. You trace your fingertip through a furrow that once brimmed with barley. It's a sun-baked scar on the landscape. Historians still argue whether this climate shift was the tipping point for a cascade of collapses or simply one stress among many. You kick at a brittle tuft of grass and remember that fringe theory about cosmic dust. Some propose that interstellar particles dimmed the sun and upset weather patterns. You smirk at the image of ancient farmers blaming extraterrestrial dandruff for their empty granaries. It's hard to know if anyone back then connected suffering crops to galactic phenomena, but it's a quirky tidbit that lingers in speculative footnotes. 3 jokes flicker in your mind. At least your houseplants only need occasional watering, not millennia-spanning droughts. Imagine the first ancient weather app mistakenly predicting rain. And if you think your tap water bills are high, consider negotiating water rights with warlords. In Egypt's southern reaches, the once reliable inundation of the Nile falters. Farmers wade into ankle-deep water where there used to be up to 20 feet of fertile floodplain. You witness granaries half empty for the first time and overhear villagers muttering about Osiris's displeasure. Some priests insist the gods have other pressing obligations, perhaps reprioritizing the celestial Netflix further than sprinkling life-giving water on earth. Meanwhile, a fringe claim suggests water priests drummed hypnotic rhythms on lotus-shaped drums, hoping to call the rains through sonic ritual. You wrinkle your nose, imagining a conga line of druids dancing in the mud. Over in Mesopotamia, irrigation canals, once meticulously maintained, become clogged with silt as fewer hands labor in the fields. You stand knee-deep in scummy water, stench of stagnation making you wish for that crocodile dung sunscreen you mocked earlier. At least it had purpose. The canal walls, lined with baked bricks, begin to slump. A creeping ruin you can almost hear groaning. Environmental tensions here are as tangible as any invading army. When you complain about potholes in your city, spare a thought for those ancient engineers wrestling with cracks that stretched for miles. Heading east, you cross into the Indus frontier, where settlements like Mohenjo-Daro confront shrinking wells. You peer down one and see dusty rings marking falling water levels once you could duck under a well lip to fetch water. Now you'd need a rope and pulley just to touch the surface. Residents experiment with deepening shafts, but every extra foot of digging yields less reward. Some locals blame angry river gods. Others swear a malevolent spirit named the Whisperer siphoned their water at night. You can't help but laugh at the name. It's picturing a ghost with a drip bucket. Amid these environmental strains, communities innovate and strain to adapt. You watch Mesopotamian elites debate building huge reservoirs. A popular fringe idea advises they carve rock basins and then interpret echoes at dusk to divine reservoir stability. You chuckle at the thought of advisors leaning in to shout, "Is your echo robust enough to hold water?" Yet large-scale hydraulic projects do emerge, proving human ingenuity can rise to climatic challenges if only temporarily. Historians still argue whether complex irrigation networks, prolonged societies, or hastened collapses through overextension. You wander into a half-abandoned village and notice fields ringed by stunted palms and leafless shrubs. The soil's salty. Crust tells you that centuries of irrigation without proper drainage have raised groundwater tables, bringing salts to the surface and killing crops. That form of salinization is a mainstream fact, documented by ancient clay tablets lamenting white death in grain fields. You sift your fingers through coarse, whitish soil and taste its bitterness on your tongue. If your garden ever got waterlogged, you just pour in sand. Imagine losing your entire empire to table salt. Inside one crumbling courtyard, a late-night debate flickers by torchlight. Elders bicker over whether to evacuate or invest grain reserves in well repair. A fringe rumor suggests some families made pact with traveling nomads, trading ancestral lands for protection charms carved from meteorite fragments. You imagine a golden amulet, promising a year of good Renangent crowdfunding at its finest. While you're amused, you also feel the gravity of real choices facing these people. Stay and starve, or wander into unknown deserts as the sun sets. You observe villages on the brink of collapse, clinging to traditions, offering sacrifices to appease elemental forces, chanting mantra-like invocations to coax seeds into sprouting. In this twilight, you sense a world teetering between perseverance and abandonment. You breathe in the dusty air, laced with a tang of parched reeds, and remember the comforting hum of that nighttime fan back home. The gap between ancient desperation and your modern comforts has never felt wider. Yet, even in this arid tension, human resilience glimmers. Some communities shift to drought-resistant grains like millet. Others develop water-saving planting techniques that stagger sowing times. You imagine a clever irrigator slipping buckets of water from plant to plant, like a thirsty but meticulous barista brewing single-shot lattes for each seedling. It's evidence that wherever stress mounts, adaptation follows, if only in fits and starts. And so you finish this leg of the journey, not at a triumphant apex, but at a brittle threshold. The promise of river-fed abundance still beckons in whispers of ancient reservoirs and communal ingenuity. But the weight of environmental shifts presses down, sowing cracks that will widen into fractures. As you rise from the dusty ground, you know the story is far from over. You carry with you the lesson that water, soil, and sky can be friend and foe in equal measure. Ahead lies the next act in civilization's drama, when communities must confront the limits they themselves have stretched too far. Section 4, you leave those dust-choked drought zones behind and find yourself under a canopy of dying trees. Their skeleton branches scratching at the sky like oversized ticklers gone rogue. You can practically smell the scent of sawdust and sweat, where loggers dragged cedar logs down to waiting rafts. The air hums with a faint echo of axes striking trunks so relentlessly that forests once teeming with wildlife have shriveled into scrubland. If you think your favorite coffee shop goes through too many paper cups, imagine an entire empire stripping entire hillsides for firewood. Shipbuilding and monumental architecture. In Mesopotamia, for instance, Sumerians exploited nearby woodlands to fuel kilns for bricks, leaving large swaths denuded by 2000 BCE. That rampant deforestation is a mainstream fact recorded in pollen samples and ancient clay tablets lamenting the scarcity of timber, which forced traders to fetch cedar from far-off Lebanon at skyrocketing prices. You run your hand over a chipped brick, feeling its grainy surface, and wonder how many donkey-drawn caravans collapsed under the weight of forest debts. Historians still argue whether ecological damage alone triggered city-state decline or acted in concert with social and climatic stresses. As you trudge through compacted soil, you notice gullies carved where once gentle rains would seep. Intensive plowing and overgrazing have turned fields into moonscapes, their topsoil mines wiped clean. You taste the grit on your tongue and recall that goats nibbling every last scrub left nothing to hold the earth in place. Quirky tidbit suggests that some farmers baked clay pellets to throw onto eroded land. thinking the hardened balls could patch soil holes, an ancient version of filling potholes with marbles. You can't help but picture someone dropping a pellet and shouting, "Fixed," while watching their new clay road disintegrate, venturing into ancient Greece. You glimpse olive groves that once carpeted hillsides, now reduced to stunted bushes. Olive wood fed blacksmith forges and trimmed burnt fields. And by the classical era, soil erosion had washed away as much as 60% of arable land in places like Attica. You crouch beside a ridge, feeling the slick of fine sediment slipping through your fingers. Jokingly, you wonder if they ever installed tiny stone terraces and charged admission for the view, ancient hillside real estate at its finest. Further west, on the shores of the Mediterranean, the Romans famously deforested vast swaths to build an empire, creating timber shortages that contributed to shipping delays. You imagine the first Roman merchant sighing, "My timber shipments delayed. Great. I'll have to invent concrete," and spoiler alert, they did. 3 light jokes drift by. If you think your neighbor's leaf blowing is annoying, spare. A thought for ancient landowners with nothing but dust storms. You'd offer gold for a single potted tree. And if planting a sapling today feels tedious, ancient farmers would laugh, saying, "Least your spade's not dragging a bull." Back upstream in the Indus Valley, urban planners once boasted covered drains and brick-lined wells. But ring that glory with anecdotal neglect, as resource demands surged, maintenance lagged. Exposed tree stumps testify to craftsman harvesting. Wood for fired pottery, leaving behind cracked kilns and brittle house beams. A fringe claim insists that some Indus people tried bioengineering by mixing crushed oyster shells into soil to restore calcium, an odd but forward-thinking attempt to replenish nutrients. You wince at the thought of collecting shells by hand, one gritty shard at a time. You wander into a semi-collapsed granary, where you discover layers of salt-crusted soil beneath fallen tiles. Centuries of irrigation without proper drainage raised the water table, leaving salts to blanket fields. That salinization is a mainstream problem that doomed crops from Egypt to Mesopotamia. You press a palm-sized crystal into your cheek, and it stings like a tiny salt lick meant for camels. You might giggle at the absurdity humans outsalted themselves, but the reality is sobering. Too much irrigation without care can backfire spectacularly. Despite mounting damage, communities rarely agreed on solutions. You happen upon a late-night council where regional governors and temple priests argue over whether to implement crop rotations or double down on granary stockpiles. The tension crackles in the torchlit hall like static before a summer storm. Some propose sacred groves left untouched for deities, while others demand immediate timber cuts for a new palace wing. Historians still argue whether these management debates reflect deliberate stewardship or powerless bickering under ecological collapse, drifting across rocky terrain. You spot the last few pines hunkering down against the wind. You pluck a fallen pine cone and roll it between your fingers, the scales sharp and unyielding. A fringe legend tells of a hermit king who proclaimed that planting a pine cone each dawn would bring back the forests, prompting villagers to squirrel away cones like prehistoric Pac-Man. You can't help but chuckle at the image of zealots bursting into homes at sunrise, chanting "Catch 'em all" for reforestation. You breathe in the hollow quiet of deforested valleys, broken only by the whisper of wind over barren fields. The weight of lost resources presses down on you, heavier than any stone pyramid block. Yet, amid the ecological decline, pockets of innovation glimmer. Some Mesopotamian farmers adopt raised beds to reduce erosion, while Egyptian crews build check dams to trap silt upstream. You imagine workers slipping miniature gates into channels. It's the ancient equivalent of DIY flood barriers. As you step from this ravaged landscape, you Feel the juxtaposition between human ambition and environmental limits. The stripped forests, gullied fields, and salty plains speak of empires overreaching their ecological credit. You recall those communal ovens from Section 1 and the shimmering river markets of Section 2, now replaced by woodless hearths and drifting dust. Yet the idea that overconsumption spelled doom remains tangled in debate. Was it ecological suicide, or just one chapter in a larger story of human resilience and reinvention? You wipe a streak of dust across your forehead and prepare to leave. The echo of axes and the hush of abandoned terraces follow you like ghosts. Ahead, you'll witness how social fractures and power struggles respond to these environmental bruises. But for now, you carry this lesson close. Exploit nature without respect, and the earth will eventually exploit you right back. You emerge from those battered terraces and dusty wells into a courtyard ringed by mud brick houses, where the tension between rulers and ruled swirls like a brewing storm. You pause under a low archway where the scent of sweat and spilled beer mingles with the faint temps of animal dung. Listen closely. Murmurs of discontent ripple through the crowd gathered for the seasonal grain distribution. It's here you witness how environmental stress translates into social fissures, and how human hierarchies snap under pressure in ancient Egypt. By around 1279 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses II, large-scale labor projects required corvée. Workers' peasants drafted seasonally to build temples and monuments. That's a mainstream historical fact. Those labor levies kept pyramids rising and obelisks towering. You see uniformed overseers pacing behind rows of exhausted men, prodding them with staffs carved from palm wood. The workers' dull grunts echo off limestone walls as they haul blocks that weigh more than your car. You wince, imagining your gym's complaints about leg day suddenly sounding like ancient battle cries. A fringe theory suggests that some laborers disguise themselves as festival entertainers to avoid the draft donned in clownish masks and juggling clay pots, forcing project managers to pay a ransom of extra bread just to get them back to work. You chuckle at the mental image of a pantomime troupe demanding overtime just for the laughs. Historians still argue whether such ruses ever existed, or if they're just the result of tongue-in-cheek scribbles in temple graffiti. You push deeper into the compound, observing a stark division. The ruling class lounges under canvas awnings, sipping spiced wine and trading political gossip, while the commoners slump against sun-baked stone, waiting for rations measured out in debins of barley. The contrast is immediate. You grasp how social stratification was cemented by grain control, with surplus storage turning priests and nobles into gatekeepers of survival. 3 light jokes flare to mind. If you ever feel your boss breathing down your neck, consider the ominous Vegetai brand stamped on your arm. If you think your paycheck is late, the overseer's sandals are ancient excuses. And if your coffee's weak, at least they didn't serve you mushy barley gruel. Venturing into ancient Mesopotamia, you find city-states like Lagash, and you're locked in rivalries fueled by class competition. Here, elites live behind high walls, their courtyards strewn with exotic blooms and ivory figurines, while artisans and laborers dwell in crowded alleys. You trace your fingers over a carved relief depicting a god-granting kingship to a bejeweled ruler, underscoring the divine right theory that elevated monarchs above hungry masses. That belief is a mainstream insight that ordered civic life, reinforcing top-down hierarchies. Yet you also overhear shopkeepers whispering about the first tax riots, when bricklayers refused to pay temple tithes. Historians still argue whether those uprisings were widespread revolts or isolated grumblings scribbled in clay petitions. As you wander past a ziggurat's massive steps, a distorted chant wafts from within, priests reciting liturgies promising good harvests for loyal subjects. One fringe account claims some rebels created mock liturgies, praising the goat-headed god Boshagutu lampoon the establishment. You snort at the idea of sacrilegious goat puns echoing through sacred halls. It's hard to know if that happened, but the tale lingers in eccentric footnotes, like the one where a dissenting scribe scrawled, "No more barley." In dripping ink, you roam into the Indus Valley town of Harappa, where society appears remarkably egalitarian, at least in the archaeological record. Wide streets and uniformly sized houses hint at minimal class difference. That's a mainstream observation, prompting admiration and envy. Imagine a city where your neighbor's home could be your own. But strolling past the Great Bath, you overhear a fringe claim that some citizens reserved private bath access for the elite, while common folk used communal pools at dawn. The idea of an ancient VIP spa hour makes you grin, picturing silk-robed nobles elbowing aside plebeians for prime poolside real estate. Historians still argue whether this legend reflects actual social stratification or simply modern projection onto a site. Its purpose remains enigmatic. The smells shift as you enter a shaded alley where pottery shops cluster. Here, you see apprentice and master working side by side, yet the master's wares fetch 10 times the price. You pick up a bowl so fine it resembles spun glass, its lip threading a whisper when you tap it. The artisanal economy thrives unperceived. Prestige, a system that lays groundwork for hereditary elites. You imagine a jealous apprentice swapping clay with wet laundry, sparking the first insurrection of artisanal sabotage. 3 jokes trail behind. If your boss ever claims we're a family, point to this mug's price tag. If you think nepotism is new, remember guildmasters married off cousins for prime workshop slots? And if you pout about your Instagram clout, these potters invented branded ceramics centuries ago, outside the marketplace. You find a gathering where men and women argue fiercely over water rights, land plots, and temple dues. Some call for codified laws to curb nobles' excesses, while others insist tradition forbids sharing sacred decrees with commoners. The voice of one orator rises above the fray, demanding an ever-flowing canal for every household, a radical plea that carries revolutionary undertones. Yet opposing voices fire back. Too much democracy will topple order. Historians still argue whether these debates were early experiments in civic inclusion or mere bluster among elites jockeying for power. Its quirky footnote emerges when you witness a traveling storyteller recounting a legend of a princess who secretly traded palace jewels for bread loaves to feed starving fishermen after canal breaches. You doubt the princess's altruism-mentioned cosplay for charity, but you can't deny the tale's dramatic flair. The crowd reacts with laughter and tears, an emotional cocktail that underscores storytelling's role in social discourse. It reminds you that narratives, whether true or fabricated, shaped public opinion long before mass media. As dusk approaches, you ascend a ramshackle wooden scaffold to peer over the settlement. The layout reveals segregated quarters, sprawling villas perched on higher ground for elites, densely packed tenements at lower elevations prone to flooding. You spot children weaving in and out of narrow lanes, their bare feet slapping stone in a warm summer rhythm. You recall that fringe tidbit about landlords hiring youth to scrawl pronable? It's graffiti under cover of Night 10 early PR campaign, if you will. The notion that teenagers once chanted slogans for coin makes you laugh at how much hasn't changed. Beneath the scaffold, the final ration is handed out. You watch faces shift from hope to bitterness as the last measure of grain trickles into crooked palms. The crackle of hushed curses mingles with the clang of empty jars. In this moment, you see how social fractures widen. Shared hardship can unite, but unequal burdens fracture communities. You feel the physical ache of injustice settle in your gut like an unwelcome guest. Stepping away, you carry a medley of impressions. The spectacle of corvée, the whispered goat god satires, the logics of divine kingship, the egalitarian promise of Indus streets, the charged debates over common rights. Each tableau shows society under strain, reshaping communal bonds through conflict and negotiation. You sense that when environmental stress collides with entrenched hierarchies, societies often fracture rather than reform. You breathe deeply, tasting the dust-laden air scented with sweat, and imagine the echo of Ponga line of disguised laborers still giggling at the edge of your mind. 3 jokes, 1 debate, and countless human dramas later. You're left with a sobering realization: when the powerful hoard resources and the powerless grow restless, the fabric of community begins to unravel. The cracks you see aren't just physical, they're moral and social, etching maps of resentment that will guide destiny's next moves. You slip into a dimly lit workshop where the scent of molten bronze mingles with the musty aroma of smoldering oil lamps. Your fingertips brush against a cool bellows handle, and you feel a rhythmic thump under your palm as a craftsman pumps air into a roaring furnace. This is where ingenuity meets routine, and you sense how easily creative sparks can flicker on then smolder out. You lean in, eager to witness the nascent marvels that once promised to shepherd humanity into grand new eras, only to stall on the threshold of true innovation. Before you stands a half-finished water clock, its brass gears glinting under lamp light. You remember that Greek kleps driedly used by judges in courtrooms to time speeches around the 3rd century. BCE was a precise timekeeper despite rudimentary mechanics. That's a mainstream historical fact. Water clocks governed civic life long before pendulums or quartz crystals ever existed. You nod in respect, imagining a modern courtroom where lawyers scramble for a stopwatch app only to be told, "Sorry, we're analog tonight." You chuckle at the thought of an ancient judge peering at dripping water, tapping foot, muttering, "Next time, bring your own sand timer." Yet, beside the clepsydra, you spy a curious device that seems half-conceived, a miniature model of a sail-propelled cart, its tiny mast awkwardly swiveling in the breeze of a hand fan. Fringe scholars whisper that Hellenistic engineers toyed with wind-powered chariots, hoping to harness Aeolian gusts across flat plains. You cringe at the idea of ancient traffic jams where every vehicle awaited a stiff breeze, while charioteers stood around fanning mini-sails. Hold on, Zeus is napping right now, won't be moving much. It's hard to know if anyone ever actually tested such toys. But you can't suppress a grin picturing an engineer scribbling design notes like, "Requires pneumatic goatskin bladders for storage." All around you, benches strewn with tools bear witness to incremental tweaks rather than radical leaps. You overhear a potter tinkering with a new wheel bearing, hoping to reduce wobble and spinning ceramic. You tap the wheel with a fingernail and feel barely perceptible vibration. "Better than your office chair's wobble," you quip silently, recalling that potter in Section 2 whose creations spun so smoothly they earned envy across the river valleys. 3 light jokes float by. If your coffee grinder ever jams, blame bad ceramics. If your office printer squeals, no ancient presses were louder. And if your mouse slips, at least it isn't a clay tablet misfiled as a sticky note. Turning, you glimpse a line of bronze sickles, identical in shape and size. You count 24 of them each as sharp as the last, each identical. For centuries, agricultural tools remained stable in design, reflecting a technological plateau rather than a spiraling ascent. That stasis is a mainstream insight. After mastering bronze casting around 1500 BCE, many societies saw minimal tool evolution for hundreds of years. Historians still argue whether this plateau stemmed from social conservatism or simply the lack of perceived need to redesign. Dependable implements, your gaze drifts to a rack of wooden prototypes, models of siege engines meant to fling stones over city walls. Some warlords rolled out crude battering rams and torsion catapults, but the fundamental mechanics barely improved from the 6th to the 2nd century BCE. A fringe tidbit claims that Roman engineers experimented with miniature ballista drones, suspending small catapult arms from kites to rain pebbles on enemy watchtowers. You tilt your head, picturing pebble rain cloud formations descending on unsuspecting guards. Incoming hailstorm, but make it military. You inhale the scent of charred wood, a reminder of how metallurgy rested on the shoulders of vast timber supplies. A vague echo recalls those deforested hills from Section 4, where fewer trees meant fuel shortages and crimped furnace temperatures. Without hot fires, bronze quality suffered, and attempts to push to early iron smelting faltered. Taste the metallic tang on your tongue as if you'd licked a rusty nail. You joke to yourself, if your car's engine sputters, maybe your blacksmith needs more forest credits. And if your home grill flares up, at least you're using charcoal. Not goat dung, briquettes. In a shadowed corner, you find a set of wax molds of Idens. Of the lost wax casting method perfected around 2000 BCE, that mainstream fact underpins the era's signature artistry. From jewelry to tiny figurines. Yet the process remains virtually unchanged for generations, emblematic of broader creative standstill. You muse, imagine telling a modern 3D printing enthusiast that their technology will stay static until ground-penetrating radar. You grin at the notion of future artisans solemnly gathering around digital clay, chanting, "May the layers align." Amid these implements and models, a single papyrus scroll catches your eye. Its half-list of fringe patents rejected by temple councils, a device to harness tidal movements along the Nile. A sun-powered oven employing magnifying glass techniques, and an aerial carriage propelled by hot air blown through tubes. You almost laugh out loud picturing priests reading these proposals. Next, you'll want horses that breathe fire. Yet it's sobering, people dreamed big, but most grandiose plans died for lack of materials, funding, or PayPal approval. Historians still argue whether institutional gatekeeping or material constraints best explain why ancient big ideas never quite took off. You run your fingers over a small coin-sized disc inscribed with geometric patterns. It's an abacus token, used for simple accounting, a mainstream precursor to modern calculators. One day, all you'll need to balance budgets is your smartphone. Back then, school children tapped pebbles on wooden boards. 3 light jokes drift past. If your Excel bill comes due, imagine paying in goatskins. If your calculator crashes, at least no one's throwing clay tablets at you in frustration, okay? And if you curse at your spreadsheets, remember ancient scribes probably swore by the goddess Nis-Aba. Your footsteps echo on stone as you turn to leave this workshop of muted breakthroughs. You feel the weight of incrementalism pressing down, niche minor, tweak useful, but none spawning revolutions. You recall that conga line of disguised laborers from Section 5 and the echoing debates over water rights. Here, the debates are quieter, but no less consequential. Communities wrestled with whether to invest in radical machinery or perfect what they already had. Those choices shaped entire dynasties, either propelling them forward or anchoring them in place. As you step out, the workshop's warm glow fades behind you, replaced by the cool night air. You breathe deeply, the faint hum of cicadas reminding you that nature's rhythms march on regardless of human invention. You understand now why many empires stagnate. Once core needs are met, the appetite for risk dims and institutions brood, over-conserving resources rather than chasing bold new ideas. Yet within those cautious walls, a few dreamers persist, scribbling plans for flying machines or water pumps that rival modern turbines. You stoke 3 parting jokes in your mind. If you ever feel bored by modern gadgets, try using a water clock for a week. If you crave Silicon Valley pace, imagine your startup paying for papyrus hosting. And if you lament slow Wi-Fi, at least you're not buffering bronze pores. With each jest, you carry home the bittersweet lesson of technological plateaus. Innovation can flourish, but it can also stall, leaving societies to contend with yesterday's achievements, even when tomorrow beckons. You step out of that glowing workshop and find yourself standing at a dusty crossroads where the horizon shivers with the silhouettes of marching strangers. The air tastes faintly of spent campfires, mingling with the acrid tang of arrowheads, scraped clean. You feel the crunch of gravel underfoot, step echoing the arrival of new faces and fading echoes of old loyalties. Here, borders blur as outsiders stream in, bringing fresh customs and fresh conflicts in equal measure. It's around 1200 BCE, and you witness the sea peoples sweeping along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Mainstream historical fact recorded in Egyptian reliefs celebrating Pharaoh Ramesses III's defense at the Battle of the Delta. You hear the clash of bronze swords against battered shields. The guttural chants of marauders meeting disciplined Egyptian ranks. Yet, even in victory, you detect unease. The Nile Delta crackles with tension. A precarious peace negotiated through treaties rather than total annihilation. A fringe theory whispers that these sea peoples weren't marauders at all, but refugees, fleeing a drowned island Atlantis, perhaps seeking asylum on Egypt's fertile plains. You wrinkle your nose at the thought, picturing Atlanteans stepping off galleys and capes, embossed with tridents, only to find themselves recycling palm fronds for shelter. Whether they carried divine trident symbols or muddy sandals, the notion lingers like salty spray on a seaside promenade. Historians still argue whether these movements were violent invasions or mass displacements driven by famine, climate change, or the lure of Egyptian grain stores. You lean against a battered chariot wheel and imagine their captains, debating grand strategy. Do we pillage the granaries or just send polite ransom notes? You smirk, recognizing that even ancient warlords might have preferred email. Not far off, you glimpse the Hittite Empire's northern frontier, where waves of Indo-European migrants once poured through Anatolian passes around 1900 BCE. Those early migrations are a mainstream insight into how chariots, horses, and proto-language spread across Eurasia. You smell burning pine resin as traders light torches to guide caravans along precarious mountain tracks, and you taste the bitterness of pine smoke on your lips. Mountain passes creak with loaded wagons. The wind whistles through rocky arches. Like ghostly heralds of upcoming change, a quirky tidbit claims that some Hittite nobles carried wooden bull effigies, believing the carved beasts would stampede foreign armies into submission if placed at city gates. You can't help but chuckle at the idea of entire battalions turning tail from a row of stationary cow sculptures. Yet that whimsy underlines how symbols, be they wooden bulls or ceremonial tridents, carry more weight than mere iron. As these newcomers settle among indigenous farmers, you sense a delicate dance unfold. You wander through a marketplace in Nugrat, where local Canaanite potters trade perfumed oils to Aegean sailors in exchange for exotic timbers. That syncretism is a mainstream fact that shaped art, language, and religion across the Levant. You inhale the sweet aroma of cedar-smoked goats and imagine scribes trading cuneiform tablets for linear B scrolls, scribbling out new dialects on damp clay, yet friction bubbles beneath the surface. Some native families resist the newcomers' harassing. Foreign shepherds for pasture rights, carving crude threats into olive trees. A fringe rumor even suggests that Canaanites dumped imported amphorae of Greek wine into the sea, believing the grape gods had insulted their local vintners. You picture drunks in archaic togas diving into waves in pursuit of submerged amphorae. Hold my laurel wreath and laugh at the absurdity. Historians still argue how deep assimilation ran. Did indigenous elites absorb foreign customs? Or did conquerors adopt local traditions to secure loyalty? You pat the worn handle of a merchant's basket and contemplate. The answer? You imagine a city council where arguments fizz, culminating in a vote. Shall we mandate Hittite-style rock reliefs on our city walls? Or stick with our traditional bull-headed idols? The compromise assigning both symbols side by side signals diplomacy more than domination. Moving west, you trace the path of the mysterious Philistines, thought to be of Aegean origin. Landing on Canaan's shores around 1175 BCE, sense their warships glinting under the sun as they beach on sandy coves, disembarking, armed and wary. Their arrival reshuffles local power dynamics, downs fortify ramparts, and cooperation treaties flutter like banners in coastal winds. You taste the salt on your lips as waves lap at your feet, a reminder that migration often follows water's call. A Palestine claim proposes that Philistine blacksmiths forged their iron weapons in secret subterranean forges, venting smoke through hollow pillars to confuse prying eyes. You shiver at the clandestine imagery, miners by day, weapons, masters by night, tendrils of smoke weaving beneath stone arches. Whether myth or memory, the tale underlines how newcomers might cloak their intentions in ritual and subterfuge. Local scribes pen clay scrolls warning of cultural dilution, their laments stretching across cuneiform tablets like ancient op-eds. You overhear a heated recitation. They bring new gods, new tongues, and worse funny hats. Uneasily at the jab, sensing both humor and genuine unease. Historians still argue whether such protests reflect mass xenophobia or the grumblings of a vocal minority. Further east, in the Fertile Crescent, you witness the arrival of nomadic Assyrian tribes pressing into settled Babylonian lands around 14th century BCE. You hear the clip-clop of studied boots against mud brick walls. A rhythmic intrusion disturbing everyday rhythms. You brush against a woven tapestry depicting the winged Assyrian sun disk, its gold leaf flaking like sunburned skin. That image underscores a mainstream fact. Assyria's martial prowess propelled it into an empire stretching from Anatolia to Persia. A quirky tidbit from palace scribes claims that one Assyrian king, bored with sieges, challenged defeated city-states to board game duels, winning victory and taxing rights through royal backgammon. You grin at that mental image. Generals setting aside spears for dice cups, whispering double or nothing on your tribute. It's an odd glimpse at how empire building sometimes mix playfulness with brutality. As these fierce newcomers impose tribute demands, you sense a slow cultural melding. Local artisans carve Assyrian-style reliefs alongside traditional Babylonian motifs. You stroll through a temple courtyard, tasting the smoky perfume of incense from a newly merged pantheon. You smell frankincense mingled with reed smoke, and it feels both foreign and familiar, an olfactory handshake across cultures. Outside the walls, tribes continue to drift. See people seeking farmland, Hittites fleeing drought, Philistines scouting. Coastal towns, Assyrians carving out new provinces. Each arrival reshuffles hierarchies, forging alliances or sparking rebellions. You stand at the crossroads again, the air humming with multiple tongues and the rattle of horse-drawn carts. You taste hope and tension in equal measure. As every handshake might birth a new dynasty, a fresh vendetta, 3 light jokes drift to mind. If you ever complain about mixing office cultures, Imagine combining chariot lords, sea raiders, and nomadic horsemen under one roof. If your neighbor's Thanksgiving guest list overwhelms you, spare a thought for small towns absorbing migrating tribes. And if you think your town's traffic is bad, consider caravans of chariots inching along ancient causeways. You listen to the evening breeze weaving through olive groves and cedar thrums, blending foreign melodies with local refrains lyres, plucked to accompaniment of unfamiliar drumbeats. You sip sweet wine flavored with dates, the vintage marked imported by Sea People Guild. You lean back, feeling that uneasy harmony where conquest and coexistence merge amid the clamor of new tongues and creaking wheels. You understand that foreign encounters don't write simple tales of domination. They craft complex tapestries of exchange, conflict, adaptation. And syncretism, as twilight hushes the roads, you realize borders in the ancient world were as porous as reed fences. You pocket a handful of traded coins, some stamped with Hittite running man, others etched with Egyptian scaraband, marvel at how cultural imprints travel. You tuck them into your pouch, tokens of human mobility long before passports or visas. Ahead lies another frontier, when invisible enemies disease and plague prove as potent as any armed host. You slip through a crumbling city gate and find yourself amid a haze of feverish coughing and frantic wails. The air tastes metallic, like someone pinched you on the tongue, and the pungent stench of vinegar-soaked rags assaults your nostrils. Bodies lie strewn in narrow lanes, limbs splayed as though tossed by careless hands. Smoke from funeral pyres drifts skyward, trailing whispers of despair. You realize you've stepped into the plague of Athens around 430 BCE, when an estimated 1/3 of the population perished. An undeniable Mayans historical fact that reshaped Athenian democracy and military fortunes. As you move closer, you notice survivors rubbing raw onions under their noses, convinced the pungent vapors stave off contagion. It's a fringe tidbit. Some Athenians smeared goat fat and juniper berries in their nostrils, hoping to filter evil vapors. You wrinkle your face, picturing bucket-lipped philosophers snorting onion chunks between debates on virtue. Historians still argue whether the plague was typhus, smallpox, or a hemorrhagic fever imported via grain ships. No one's certain which microbial culprit crashed this party. We've passed a makeshift clinic, where healers chant incantations over steaming pots of rosemary and myrrh. One odd remedy involves placing a live rooster on the patient's stomach, expecting the bird to absorb illness an early and possibly cruel version of catching someone's flu. If you stifle a laugh, imagine a rooster flapping loose feathers on your chest while you sneeze. 3 light jokes dance in your head. If you think your pet gets enough attention, try sharing bed space with a plague-absorbing chicken. If your app's cold, remedy feels dubious. At least it doesn't involve live poultry. And if your office's health policies frustrate you, remember ancient hospitals drafted chickens for immunology trials? You round a corner and enter a bustling Egyptian port where ships unload barley sacks crusted with dried rats. That rodents carried Yersinia pestis centuries later is a mainstream insight into plague transmission. But here, in the 6th century CE's Justinian plague, you smell mildew and hobnail boots. Merchants collapse onto gangplanks. Sailors shove blankets over their faces to block the fetid air. Historians still argue whether the Justinian pandemic spread primarily via rat fleas or through contaminated grain shipments. But its death toll, tens of millions, cast a long shadow over Rome's recovery. A whimsical legend surfaces, no fewer than a dozen latantic apothecaries purportedly bottled locust oil mixed with ground snake venom as an elixir, convinced it could strike death out of your veins. You can't help but grimace at the image of snake oil salesmen, literally ladling liquid from serpent skins. It's a quirky tidbit that floats among dusty papyri. A reminder that desperation births creative and, sometimes, lethal remedies. From the docks, you hurry inland to the Indus frontier, where monsoon floods churn silt and sewage into stagnant pools. Here, waterborne illnesses like dysentery and cholera ravage villages, mainstream tragedies recorded in later Ayurvedic texts lamenting watery plague. You kneel by a trench jammed with bodies clad in water-soaked rags. The sudden bellows of a hippo stomping through marshes nearby snaps you back. Local fishermen once claimed these beasts shielded them from disease, believing hippo skin secretions were antiseptic. You grin at that fringe theory. Ancient hippo? Zoo, quarantine, anyone? As day turns to dusk, you trudge toward a Greco-Roman military camp on the Syrian frontier. Tent flaps flap in the breeze as legionnaires shuffle by, faces gaunt and eyes sunken. You catch sight of an officer tallying wrist scars, each a scarlet dot marking another case of smallpox. Writing tablets record opening lines of desperate pleas for reinforcements. Fewer troops mean less grain-guarded and more vulnerability to enemies. Historians still argue whether localized troop losses or economic collapse more directly triggered Rome's eastern frontier implosion. But the correlation between plague and military decline is unmistakable. At the camp's edge, you sidle up to a makeshift apothecary booth where a gnarled old surgeon crushes dried pomegranates and applies the paste to wounds. Fringe lore claims this mixture repelled demonic disease, worms burrowing in flesh and embryonic germ theory. If you squint, you watch him slap the paste onto a soldier's festering leg, dust clouds rising like ghost laughter. 3 jokes flit through your mind. If you think your topical antibiotic burns, imagine the sting of pomegranate mash. If your AirPods fall out in public, be glad you're not wearing poultices. And if your bandages ever feel scratchy, at least they don't crumble into medieval dust. You push on to a once glorious Sumerian city, half buried by centuries of shifting sands. In its ruins, you glimpse a small shrine to Nergal, god of plague and death. Priests still leave offerings of incense and barley beer to mollify his wrath. Mainstream behavior recorded in old Babylonian laments. A fringe commentary whispers that some devotees wore leather vials of mummified locust guts around their necks, thinking the crushed insects granted immunity. You shudder at the thought of sweaty festival goers jingling jars of insect entrails at temple fairs. Everywhere you go, fear shapes daily life. Marketplaces empty, workers stay home, temples echo with hollow chants. You taste the bitterness of boiled plantain skins served as cheap soup in a refugee camp near Anatolia. You recall that water clock from Section 6 counting out your grandmother's teacup time. Here, it ticks down the last moments before someone collapses. You breathe deeply. The acrid smoke of sacrificial fires forming a haze you could slice with a knife. Yet, in this gloom, pockets of resilience glimmer. You meet a healer mixing turmeric paste with henia, practice grounded in antimicrobial properties you'd affirm with modern lab tests. A local midwife uses childbirth rituals to isolate infected mothers from newborns, reducing infant mortality. Historians still argue whether these grassroots measures truly stemmed outbreaks or simply documented an ebb in cases. Sense life's stubborn pulse beneath the devastation. You spot children playing near once verdant orchards, weaving pale branches into makeshift dolls. Their laughter rings fragile, yet defiant, echoing the jokes you've carried. If they can pretend plague salads are edible, perhaps recovery looms somewhere beyond despair. You smile, tucking a tattered cloth doll into your robe Paquita token of human tenacity amid rot as midnight approaches. You step onto a gentle knoll, overlooking smoldering chimneys and silent courtyards. The moon glints off scattered pottery shards and shattered amphorae once used to carry wine. now repurposed to store vinegar, Europe's first disinfectant. You inhale the cool night air, tasting the sharpness of survival itself. Adaptation. Flickers in the shadows, quarantines, herbal remedies, and primitive vaccination rituals like variolation, blowing powdered smallpox scabs into noses. That early inoculation glimpse is mainstream evidence of medical ingenuity long before Jenner's cowpox breakthrough. The wind carries distant echoes, bird cries, temple bells, and faint coughs reminding you disease never sleeps. You remember goat fat sunscreen from Section 2, environmental collapse from Section 3, and corrupted hierarchies from Section 5. All these forces, water disputes, drought, war, converge with invisible pathogens to topple societies. Your heart pounds as you grasp the raw truth. Civilization's fragility often hinges on microscopic foes. You rise and dust yourself off, carrying the weight of rotting cities and silent homes. In your pocket, that cloth doll and a handful of disinfectant vinegar crystals rattle like survivors' prayers. Ahead lies a different battleground, when economies buckle under collapsed trade networks, and coins grow scarce, leaving empires bankrupt before their people's eyes. You slip into an abandoned marketplace where broken pottery shards clog the gutters and the stench of spoiled grain mingles with salt water from the idle docks. Empty stalls gape like molar cavities, and the wind rustles faded awnings once striped in vibrant indigo and saffron. You taste the brine in the air, as if the sea itself mourns lost commerce. It's here you feel the pulse of economic unraveling trades, lifeblood slowing to a drip. Then, to a spurt of panic, centuries earlier, in the twilight of the late Bronze Age around 1200 BCE, you would have found this very port humming with Canaanite amphorae, Mycenaean oil jars, and Cypriot copper ingots on intricate panorama of Mediterranean trade. That interconnected network's collapse is a mainstream historical fact, marked by sealed palace archives in Ugarit, abruptly ending correspondence with distant partners. Once flourishing, sea lanes go silent, and suddenly finding tin for bronze tools becomes as impossible as ordering artisanal coffee on a desert island. Historians still argue whether seismic activity, invasions, or internal revolt delivered the fatal blow. But the result is the same. Supply convoys vanish, and prosperity evaporates. You pick through the detritus and discover bits of wax-sealed clay marked with snail-shaped stamps. Fringe lore whispers these seals were coated in conch shell paste so they'd survive salt spray. A kind of ancient waterproof tracking system, proto-blockchain for Bronze Age bureaucrats. You squint, imagining merchants exclaiming, "Our amphorae, our time-stamped," as they chased rogue sailors. Whether or not that trick ever worked, it's a quirky tidbit demonstrating how far traders pushed ingenuity before their world crumbled. With maritime routes cut, Kenland caravans choked on sand-clogged roads. You trudge past a caravanserai where packs of gaunt camels huddle in silent accusation. The empty ledgers inside show ledger after ledger of uncollected taxes and unpaid tolls. You sense the mounting desperation. Artisans can't source raw materials. Soldiers go unpaid, and bureaucrats slump over desks in hopeless piles of unanswered petitions. Commerce, once a ceaseless tide, withdraws to expose the slimy stones beneath. Fast forward a millennium to the Roman Empire's 3rd century crisis of commodities, when coinage debasement spiraled into runaway inflation. That's a mainstream historical insight. Emperors slashed silver content in denarii to fund armies, having purity between 250 and 275 CE, and prices soared in tandem. You hold a warped bronze coin stamped Ivlia in your hand, its meager weight a cruel joke. You'd laugh if the number of coins needed to buy a loaf of bread weren't climbing like a runaway chariot, doubling every month. Ancient bread watchers must have thought they were on subscription plans with zero cancellation policy. A whispered fringe theory suggests some alchemists tried mixing powdered shark teeth into molten silver to bulk up coinage. Fortunately, the only outcome was a nasty metallic aftertaste and a host of counterfeit dents. You shudder, picturing coin collectors spitting out shark-infused currency, not exactly primer on predator-prey economic theory. Whether this shark fin debasement ever reached circulation is anybody's guess. But it's a reminder that when money falters, desperation breeds creative, if dubious, schemes. Back in this decaying agora, local shopkeepers scrawl prices on palm leaves in soot-black ink, adjusting rates hourly to keep pace with inflation. Barter returns with a vengeance. You swap a length of linen for a chicken, then trade the chicken for an oil lamp, and soon you're juggling barter deals like a hyperactive stockbroker. Historians still argue whether barter resurgence was a temporary stopgap or a deeper sign that trust in coinage had permanently eroded. You almost admire ancient entrepreneurs hustling goat cheese for grain. When you realize you wouldn't last a morning in their shoes, no Venmo, no credit cards, just raw haggling. Aside from hyperinflation, commerce suffers from crumbling infrastructure. You step over toppled milestones and eroded causeways, once paved for legions and merchants alike. Stagecoach inns stand deserted, their tiled courtyards littered with rotting hops and moldering wheat sacks. A few hardy traders risk the journey, tying themselves to mules to ward off highwaymen. Legend has it those who bound themselves with leather straps earned discounts on tolls because sheriffs presumed only desperados would chain up like that. You crack a smile at the mental picture of a tethered merchant sprinting after a rogue mule. Hold still, can only count my silver pieces once. 3 light jokes float to mind. If you think your bread costs too much, remember Roman bakers once charged by the weight of your empty purse? If your Wi-Fi jitters frustrate you, at least you're not relying on a sand-powered abacus network. And if your bank ever freezes your account, imagine losing entire city-state budgets to marauding sea peoples. You lean against a fractured column, hearing the echo of deserted harbors and shuttered workshops. Around you, grain stores once bulging with surplus stand vacant, their wooden doors ragged and flapping. Merchants have abandoned their ledgers, and tax collectors roam empty fields, collecting nothing but dust. The elite flee to fortified villas inland, sealing gates against destitute masses demanding their share. Social cohesion snaps tighter than a brittle rope. Yet even here, small-scale markets persist. A few itinerant traders paddle down neglected canals in leaky barges, peddling local salt and coarse pottery. You buy a chipped bowl for a scrap of bronze, ridiculously skewed exchange. But at least it buys you a momentary nod of normalcy. Local healers charge barley rations for herbal poultices, while caravan guides want payment in kind one night's lodging and a handful of dried figs. These microeconomies echo the resilience you've seen before. Barter pods sprouting in economic fissures, keeping embers of exchange glowing as dusk settles. You notice distant fires marking makeshift settlements, refugee camps forming around the few remaining market hubs. The murmur of bargain negotiations drifts on the breeze, underscored by murmurs of discontent. No grain, no peace. Collapse of long-distance trade didn't just starve economies, it severed the cultural arteries that let ideas, art, and religion circulate. You feel the void left by vanished merchants and silenced marketplaces, a yawning silence where laughter, haggling, and multilingual chatter once thrived. You breathe deeply, inhaling the mingled scents of salt, dust, and half-rotted barley. The economic unraveling here is more than price spikes. It's the unspooling of social contracts and trust. You recall the jugglers evading corvée in section wool. those tide-carried sea peoples in Section 7. And the snake oil apothecaries of Section 8 tall, adding layers to this tapestry of decline. Tomorrow, you'll follow the spiritual upheavals that tried to glue these torn communities back together. You wander away from the hushed echoes of empty harbors and find yourself at the foot of a half-ruined temple. Its once brilliant frescoes faded into chalky whispers of past glory. Incense tendrils curl through cracked columns, wrapping around your senses like a faint memory. Voices murmur in distant chambers, priests reciting litanies to placate gods who may have already abandoned their sanctuaries. You slip inside, brushing fingertips across wet-stained stone, realize that belief itself can crumble as swiftly as brick. In Rome, around the 3rd century CE, the venerable state cult's Vesta's hearth flame. Jupiter's thunder lost imperial backing as Christianity's followers climbed the social ladder. By 380 CE, the Edict of Thessalonica declared Nicene Christianity the empire's official religion, a mainstream historical fact that erased ancient rites almost overnight. You imagine a Vestal virgin, once mistress of flame, standing in bewilderment as her sacred fire is snuffed out, only to face the indignity of a pension cut and the forced adoption of tunics instead of togas. It's a stark reminder that when gods swap places on the podium, devotees scramble like jackpot contestants at a cosmic game show. Nearby, in a shadowed niche, you discover a fringe account of druidic mind mirrors, polished basalt slabs erected in forest clearings, supposedly channeling lunar rays to induce prophetic visions. You squint at the chipped edges and picture hooded figures gazing into reflective surfaces, chanting, "Be me a vision, O cosmic cat whiskers." Whether any Celtic seer truly saw tomorrow's meltdown through moonlight is anyone's guess. But the image lingers like an old dream you half remember. Historians still argue whether these devices were real instruments of divination or merely turf markers for rival priestly clans. You glide deeper into the sanctum, passing alcoves lined with smashed clay votives, statuettes of bulls, fish, and miniature chariots once offered by worshippers in thanks or plea. A startling mainstream detail surfaces. At Delphi, the Pythias oracle shifted from inhaling ethylene vapors to inhaling hyperactive gossip as her temple's finances dwindled. People came less to hear divine guidance and more to catch up on palace scandals. You stifle a laugh at the thought of an ancient QAnon meeting around a tripod, proclaiming, "I heard Zeus is in on it." The decline of oracular authority underscores how once untouchable sanctuaries can devolve into town square rumor mills. Thrusting through broken murals, you enter a nave where faded frescoes depict Ra in a chariot, blazing across scarred skies. Yet even in the heart of Egypt, old beliefs stagger under weight of foreign faiths. After Alexander's conquests, syncretic deities like Serapis blended Greek and Egyptian traits. That cultural blend is a mainstream fact exemplified by colossal temples in Alexandria, dedicated to mixed pantheons. You trace a chipped headdress on an inscrutable god and envision priests with accents muddled like multilingual morning radio. 3 light jokes drift by. If you ever fumble your prayer language, at least your gods won't demand subtitles. If your church's coffee tastes bland, hail the ancient priests who brewed lotus-infused tea. And if your meme stocks confuse you, remember Instagram influencers in togas once hawked divine artifacts on papyrus. A local guide in earnest youth with lantern in hand shares a fringe tale that some worshippers of Mithras held midnight bull initiations involving ritualistic cheese wheels. You blink at the absurdity. Hooded figures rolling full-fat Gruyere through damp hypogea, chanting Om Nam Bull. It's hard to imagine sturdy Romans slipping on cheese rounds while pledging loyalty to a subterranean savior. But the story floats among niche manuscripts like a floating cheese keg at a mystery cult rave. Historians still argue whether Mithraic ceremonies ever involved dairy, or if dairy claims were later jests, scribbled by Christians. Lampooning pagan rites. You pass a row of niches smeared with black ash remnants of bonfires, once purged by imperial decree. People tossed pagan icons into roaring flames as Christianity's legions marched in. You breathe in the acrid odor of burned incense and wood resin, a smell not unlike overenthusiastic barbecue. 3 jokes surface. If you thought you're burned, toast smelled bad, consider the aroma of a smoldering idol. If your campfire songs get annoying, at least you're not chanting for divine rectitude. And if your grill lighter fails, be grateful you don't need a bishop's blessing to ignite it. Stepping outside into a courtyard strewn with collapsed pedestals, you overhear a heated debate. Should temples repurpose themselves as Christian basilicas, or be razed to make way for new sanctuaries? One minister insists on smashing every idol. 2 dust iconoclasm for spiritual hygiene, while another pleads for adaptive reuse, dreaming of a half-pagan, half-Christian temple too. 0. The tension crackles like static before a storm. Historians still argue whether disruptive iconoclastic policies accelerated social cohesion or deepened sectarian divides. You make your way to a quiet chapel carved into the Raqqa Christian site where congregants once huddled beneath flickering oil lamps. Intriguingly, beneath its floor you find graffitied symbols. A chiro scratched next to a faint owl insignia, hinting at clandestine syncretism. You crouch to inspect the overlap of crosses and bird shapes. Sense the ghost of worshippers who balanced new beliefs with ancestral traditions. It's a fragile coexistence. It's precarious as balancing your phone on a stack of prehistoric coins. Nearby, a dozen pilgrims release doves from a makeshift aviary, a ritual to symbolically free divine favor. You inhale the musky scent of bird droppings and ask yourself if this flight really mattered. A fringe commentary suggests some devotees attached tiny scrolls to dove legs, hoping the birds would deliver prayers to celestial heights. You laugh at the image of pigeon-posted prayers orbiting the gods, your wish list, eternal sunshine. 1 golden halo, please. Amen. 3 gentle jokes drift to mind. If your group chat ever feels chaotic, consider launching paper cranes as divine messengers. If you misplace your keys, be glad you're not waiting for a dove courier. And if your social media notifications overwhelm you, imagine receiving carved stone tablets in return. As dusk settles, you touch a faintly glowing fish mosaic remnant of a Christian symbol overlaid on a 7th century syncretic chapel. You sense the quiet resilience of belief, even as temples topple and priestly robes fade to dust. The fusion of old and new has left fractures. Emerging Christian doctrines clashed with entrenched pagan rituals, creating spiritual rifts that echoed through every level of society, from peasant to prince. You inhale the cool evening air, scented with damp moss growing over toppled altars, and realize faith can both anchor and undo a civilization. The fracturing of shared beliefs severs communal lifelines. When gods change, so too do laws, taxes, and social norms. You recall those empty markets from Section 9, where haggling voices once mixed with liturgical chants voices, now muted by disillusionment or forced conversion. Tonight, you leave this silent temple courtyard carrying the weight of burnt iconography and whispered holy verses. You tuck 3 parting jokes into your pocket Tunyon sniffing vestals. Moonlit druid mirrors can convent post tokens of how human faith oscillates between earnest devotion and playful absurdity. You've seen mainstream decrees that reshaped empires, fringe rituals that sparked wonder, and debates still raging among scholars. Ahead lies the next crucible, when climate catastrophes snap like brittle reeds, flooding fields and forging new paths to collapse. But for now, you step away from these hallowed ruins, senses tingling with incense residue and candle soot. ready to trace the next tremors in civilization's undoing. You trudge out of those hallowed temple courtyards and find yourself on a windswept plain where the sky crackles with foreboding clouds. The air is heavy, charged with the metallic scent of ionized particles. You can almost taste the electric tang on your tongue. Underfoot, the ground throbs ever so slightly, as if the earth itself is inhaling before it unleashes its fury. You stand at the threshold of climatic chaos, where floods, droughts, and cataclysmic eruptions rewrite the destinies of entire civilizations. First, you witness the colossal eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE. A deafening roar rips through the sky, and you shield your face from scalding ash plumes billowing overhead. That volcanic blast is a mainstream historical fact. It unleashed tsunamis that battered the northern shores of Crete and darkened eastern Mediterranean skies for years, disrupting Minoan trade and agriculture. You taste grit on your lips as fine gray dust settles like a grim snow. And you wonder if the Minoans ever glanced up at ash-laden sunsets and muttered, "That's our sunblock situation, gone sideways." Historians still argue whether Thra's fallout directly triggered the Bronze Age collapse or merely served as one impactful stress among many. As the ash drifts, you stumble upon a fringe folktale. Thera's inhabitants purportedly crafted puppets from burnt olive branches, dangling them at windows to scare away the sky and restore clear weather. You can't help but grin at the image of villagers shaking charred olive stick marionettes, barking orders at the clouds, "Shoo, shoo, get back behind the horizon." Whether anyone actually staged these puppet plays is anyone's guess, but it's a quirky tidbit that endures in oral tradition. You trudge onward into the lifeless aftermath. Fields once fertile now lie smothered under thick silt deposited by catastrophic flash floods. You kneel by a gutter clogged with mud and taste its chalky residue. It recalls that deforestation you saw in Section 4 hills stripped of trees, channeling every raindrop straight into valley basins. Without roots to anchor the soil, torrential rains carve deep gullies, washing away grain stores and burying villages intact. 3 light jokes flicker through your mind. At least your smartphone weather alerts don't bury your house. Imagine complaining about soggy socks when an entire shoreline vanishes. And if your coffee grounds get stuck, be grateful you're not stranded in ankle-deep sludge further inland. You approach Mesopotamia around 250 BCE, when the Tigris and Euphrates rivers overflow in a once-in-a-millennium flood. You wade through chest-high water that laps at rooftop beams. That inundation is a mainstream fact recorded on Babylonian clay tablets, cataloging the great water that washed our temples away. You press your palm to a sodden brick wall and feel the swollen moisture seep through as if the mud itself is weeping. Historians still argue whether this deluge was supercharged by upstream landslides or an abrupt monsoon surge. No one's quite certain what flipped the switch on such extreme flooding. In a fringe corner of the archaeological record, someone claims survivors hung carved clay fish talismans from doorways, believing they'd appease river gods and divert the water's course. You wrinkle your nose at the notion. Nice try, Mr. Carp. You imagine villagers chuckling, but you also sense how human ingenuity clings to ritual when reason fails. Scarred by floods, you trudge into a parched plateau where rainfall has abandoned the land for decades. It's the 4.2 kiloyear event, revisited in Section 3's drought tableau. But this time, the scene is China's Yellow River Basin around 2200 BCE. Kick at cracked earth, inhaling dust that tastes as dry as sawdust. That prolonged drought is a mainstream insight sourced from pollen spores and loess deposits, showing drastic precipitation drops spanning centuries. You watch footprints of abandoned ox-drawn plows etched into terraces long deserted. Historians still argue whether these arid decades fractured dynastic rule or simply prompted nomadic migrations that reshaped China's early kingdoms. Amid the dust, you find a local legend. Elders spun tales of sacrificial drones, caged eagles, released into parched skies, expected to summon rains with their wings beating. You grin at how ancients gamified weather control. Release one eagle, get one cloud. And you wonder how many birds were disappointed by their lack of meteorological prowess. Night falls, and you pause by a smoldering campfire in the Indus Valley, recalling Section 2's river flourish. Here monsoon patterns have veered unpredictably. Around 2000 BCE, bringing flash floods one season and weeks-long droughts the next. Brick-lined canals swell, then shrivel into cracked channels, betraying every shift in sky's mood. That climate volatility is a mainstream detail derived from ancient well logs recording water levels sliding mile by mile. Tia, you dip a cupped hand into stagnant canal water and wrinkle your nose at the algae bloom. It tastes like old gym socks steeped in pond scum. 3 light jokes drift through. If you think your faucet sputters, imagine your entire canal turning into a tadpole nursery. If your pool water goes green, at least it's not a city's sole irrigation source. And if you're annoyed by sprinkler runs, remember ancient farmers pitched them entirely? You notice local villagers erecting makeshift windbreaks from reed mats, hoping to shield fields from dust storms whipped up by shifting monsoon fronts. A fringe note mentions they rubbed donkey dung on the mats, believing the aroma would ward off drought spirits. You bite back laughter and imagine a trailer for the Great Dung Shield, coming soon to a reed thicket near you. Moving west, you climb fertile slopes of the Andes around 535 CE, feeling a sudden chill descend. Strange, you think after all, it's summer. But you're witnessing the late antique Little Ice Age, triggered by volcanic eruptions that dimmed sunlight for years. Temperatures dip, glaciers advance, and seasonal rains vanish. That climatic anomaly is a mainstream fact pieced together. From tree rings showing narrow growth bands and Andean ice core samples thick with sulfate deposits. You taste cold on your tongue and shiver, clutching your tunic tighter. Historians still argue whether this chilling period or contemporaneous pandemics weighed more heavily on the fall of Near Eastern empires. A fringe suggestion has locals performing llama bone divinations, breaking thigh bones over open flames to summon heat back into the atmosphere. You grin at the prospect of crowd-funded bone fracture rituals, sponsor a Yeti's return. And you wonder if the llamas were ever told their bones carried the Arctic inside. By dawn, you've traversed mute riverbeds, ashen slopes, and barren fields where only hardy thistles dare to grow. Each scenario there's eruption, Mesopotamian floods, Himalayan droughts, Andean chills paints a canvas of extremes that battered societies from Greece to China to South America. You recall the conga line of disguised laborers from Section 5? The puppet weather shows of burned thicket Thera, and rivers choked by deforestation in Section 4, all threads, weaving into this tapestry of environmental trial. Yet amidst these calamities, you spy glimmers of resilience. In Mesopotamia, some communities built raised platform villages safe from floodwaters. In China, settlers experimented with deep well irrigation to tap stable aquifers. In the Andes, farmers carved terraces that warmed chilly soils with captured sunshine. You taste the tang of fermented maize beer brewed at higher altitudes, a bright note against frost-bitten mornings. 3 final jokes surface. If your GPS ever misdirects you, imagine trusting cloud patterns. If your rain boots leak, spare a thought for those treading ankle-deep silt. And if your thermostat ever fails, at least it won't leave. You're tending ancient terraces at 14,000 feet. You stand atop a barren ridge as the first pale rays of sun pierce broken cloud layers. A faint rainbow arcs over distant ruins, as if the sky briefly remembers its former generosity. You inhale the fragile scent of scorched earth and recall the silent promise of adaptation that humans, when cornered by climate's merciless hand, can still innovate, rebuild, and sometimes even flourish anew. But you also sense the precarious balance, push any system too far. And the next flood or frostbite may be the one that civilization never weathers. You slip through a shattered gateway into a hushed settlement where broken scripts and fading frescoes testify to fading identities. The air tastes of damp parchment and mildew, as if every wall drips ink. You run your fingers along chipped masonry, inscribed with half-legible glyphs, Phoenician letters once carried by traders across the Mediterranean, now chipped away by time. That Phoenician-derived alphabet spreading as far as Carthage by 800 BCE is a mainstream historical fact, marking the first widely adopted writing system. You breathe in the musty hush, pondering how letters that once forged empires can vanish like mist. Historians still argue whether this collapse stemmed from conquest, internal schism, or economic collapse. In the half-light, you notice a flimsy wooden cart piled with broken clay tablets inscribed in linear Betha script of Mycenaean Greece, undeciphered until the mid-20th century. These tablets, all packed in a damp storeroom since 1200 BCE, now crumble in your grasp. You recall that Thera eruption from section 11, its ash layer preserving Minoan frescoes while wiping out Mycenaean strongholds, as some fringe accounts claim. Scribes hid in labyrinthine basements, copying texts backward in invisible snailing to guard culture from invaders. You wrinkle your nose, picturing a scribe snorting snail mucus through a straw like a medieval vape-pan, absurd yet oddly endearing. Image. As you step into a collapsed hall that once hosted civic gatherings, you hear echoes of a cacophony now gone. Debate in old dialects, poets reciting epic verse. That oral tradition anchored community memory until, by the so-called Greek Dark Ages around 1100 BCE, literacy plunged and heroic song nearly died out. It's a mainstream observation. That between Mycenaean collapse and Homer's epics came centuries of silence in writing. You trace a palm over the eroded floor, tasting the grit under your nails. And think how your smartphone's autosave feels miraculous compared to the fragility of clay tablets. Faint graffiti on the wall reads, "Only goats wear fancy sunscreen." A callback to Section 2's crocodile dung sunscreen rumor. You laugh softly, imagining scholars quipping that goat dung sunscreen offered perfect SPF superior preservation of frescoes. 3 light jokes drift through. If you dropped your phone today, you'd mourn its shattering like an entire colony. Of bees, if your autocorrect betrays you, recall scribes battling invisible snail ink. And if your screen goes blank, at least you're not staring at a half-erased clay tablet. You wander to a courtyard where stone benches circle a broken column. Nearby, a once vibrant mosaic calcium tiles glinting under torchlight now lies patched with mismatched pebbles. In Roman North Africa, after the Vandal invasions of the 5th century CE, many public artworks went unmaintained, and local artisans replaced missing tesserae with whatever they could find, creating jarring modernist collages centuries before. Modern art. That decline in artistic patronage is a mainstream detail. The Vandals' sack of Carthage severed imperial support, leaving communities to DIY their mosaics. You crouch, tasting the bitterness of chipped marble under your tongue. And imagine a Byzantine curator swooning. One fringe whisper insists that some painters, desperate to rescue murals, applied crushed beetle carapaces as pigment for an invisible lacquer that only became visible under moonlight. You squint at the cracked paint and imagine nocturnal restorers shaking fireflies over damp walls, chanting glow or else. It's hard to know if anyone tried such alchemy, but the idea lingers like glowing insects in your mind. Stepping. Beyond the courtyard, you pass a cluster of simple wooden houses whose planked walls threaten to collapse under ivy. Blacksmith shops lie silent, hammers still poised over anvils. That silence after the Roman withdrawal from Britain around 410 CE allowed native Celtic languages like Brythonic to resurge but fractured into Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. That linguistic fragmentation is a mainstream insight showing how political collapse seeds dialectal divergence. You press your ear to a door and sense the hum of unintelligible chants in a vanished tongue. You taste the mustiness from a rotting doorframe, as if every house holds the ghost of a lost conversation. You recall Section 9's panic barter, then spot a tattered cloth banner. It's featuring a stylized eagle, once the emblem of a late antique legion, over a crudely drawn Celtic knot. That syncretic symbol hints at local warlords fusing Roman military tradition with indigenous art. Historians still argue whether these hybrids signify genuine cultural fusion or opportunistic branding by petty kings. 3 jokes drift by. If you think startup logos changed too fast, remember ancient warlords rebranded half their banners overnight. If your QR code scanner malfunctions, at least it's less confusing than deciphering sub-Roman graffiti. And if you hate when apps auto-update, imagine waking up to a new imperial seal on your doorstep. You climb a narrow stair toward a small church whose plaster walls bear Arab calligraphy scratched over earlier Christian frescoes. That layering speaks of Sicily around the 9th century CE. An Islamic conquest introduced Arabic script and left Byzantine art half obscured. That is a mainstream fact illustrating how artistic landscapes warp under successive rulers. You brush soot from an icon of St. Lucia to reveal a faint crescent moon. You breathe in the scent of scorched plaster and think about how your Instagram feed morphs with every algorithm update hiding things you've loved, replacing them with strangers' memes. In a dark corner, you find carved Ogham letters on an oak. Post the primitive script of early medieval Ireland. Each notched line once encoded names and land boundaries. But by the 12th century, Latin script's ascendancy eclipsed Ogham, and these carvings became misunderstood curiosities. Historians still argue whether Ogham's decline was forced by church reforms or happened organically through ecclesiastical schooling. You trace your fingertip along the notches, tasting bark's bitterness, to sense how swiftly written culture can outpace oral mnemonic systems. You drift toward a scriptorium where rotting vellum scrolls lie scattered like fallen leaves. You scoop a sheet dipped in mold and sniffed a reek of ammonia, like stale socks left in a humid gym bag. Amid the rot, you discover an illuminated initial on angel's wing haloed in gold leaf. That fleeting flourish hints at Carolingian Renaissance efforts around 800 CE to revive classical motifs under Charlemagne's patronage. That mainstream revival underscores how artistic and linguistic traditions ebb and flow. Yet as the empire splintered after Louis the Pious, those scriptoria lost funding, and many manuscripts were lost to neglect or repurposed as cattle troughs. A fringe anecdote claims monks licked barnyard troughs to retrieve hidden ink, an ironic red ink rationing tactic. You can't help but grin at the image of oinky bibliophiles collecting drips of medieval scholarship. Outside, the village well stands dry, its stones slick with moss. A broken sign proclaims, "Local tongue swap, Old Belgian next to Saxon." You recall Section 7's migrations and smell the damp moss as if languages themselves grew like fungus here. This patchwork of dialects meant neighbors often struggled to communicate trading gestures instead of stories. You share a fleeting laugh at how modern texting abbreviations seem tame compared to sign-hand-drawn negotiations in border hamlets. 3 light jokes appear. If you struggle with autocorrect between English and Spanish, imagine wrestling Brythonic and Old Norse. If your emoji game falters, At least people won't carve gibberish into doorposts. And if your group chat splinters into multiple threads, spare a thought for communities split by dialect. As daylight dims, you wander to an abandoned amphitheater where moss-covered seats cradled the wind's sighs. Once, crowds cheered tragedies in Attic Greek. Stones crack under ivy. In the ruins of Ephesus, show business vanished with the decline of urban elites and public performances ceased. That theatrical downturn is a mainstream fact, showing how artistic patronage collapses alongside social structures. You sit, feeling the cool stone press into your bones, tasting the damp chill. You imagine an amused ghost playwright scribbling final lines in the margin. The end. Cue tumbleweed. You rise, brushing stray leaves from your cloak as you revisit fragments of culture, lost alphabets, defaced mosaics, syncretic banners, dabbling monks, and empty amphitheaters. Each fragment whispers of communities unraveling when external pressures fractured shared identity. You sense how language, art, and ritual form the glue of society, and once that glue dissolves, cohesion slides away like water from a sun-baked wall. You step through the crumbled arch one last time, carrying a pebble from the amphitheater as a tangible trace of vanished unity. The twilight air carries the scent of damp earth and rotting wood, testament to impermanence. You recall goat dung sunscreen, labyrinthine snail ink, in the mosaic collages of Section 4, all fragments of human creativity and folly. In this mosaic of losses, you perceive the delicate lattice of culture break a few beams, and a whole hall may fall. You breathe deeply, letting the world's hushed whispers settle around you. Ahead lies the unraveling of leadership in Section 13, and the tale continues, guided by the lessons of these lost tongues and shattered art. You step through the fractured gateway of the Hittite royal citadel, now a hushed labyrinth of silent corridors and overturned thrones. The air tastes of smoldering torches long extinguished, laced with the faintest tank of decaying papyrus. You brush against a moss-covered wall where painted chariots once paraded, their lapis blue steeds charging eternity. Here, power was a whispered game of shadows. One misstep or betrayed glance and a kingdom could unravel. You sense the tremor underfoot, as if the very stone remembers each footfall of plotting nobles. In those final days around 1180 BCE, Ptolemy to ascended amid a tide of conspiracies and usurpers. That succession crisis is a mainstream fact recorded in fragmentary splate annals that list rival claimants slaughtered in secret chambers. Elites vied for regnal seals as though they were hot coals, fearing any wrong word would scorch a dynasty's legitimacy. Historians still argue whether royal assassination or external pressures finished off Hattie. But either way, the throne's wobble sent shockwaves through vassal states. You overhear a fringe whisper claiming that a celestial eclipse foretold the king's death, then that high priests orchestrated a coup beneath the darkened sun. According to the tale, conspirators draped temple altars in black linen and chanted for lunar vengeance as palace guards turned their spears inward. Whether any noble ever sank a dagger under an eclipsed sky or simply blamed cosmic voodoo for internal murder remains uncertain, but it's a quirky tidbit that clings like dust to ancient stones. You almost snort at the idea of plotting in a blackout. Sorry, I can't see your face, but hey, stab away. You wind up the marble steps into Egypt's sunlit Hall of Pillars, where Amenhotep IV once proclaimed the Aten supreme. That religious revolution around 1353 BC, renaming himself Akhenaten and tearing down Amon's temples is a mainstream testament to ruler missteps that can fracture society's spiritual bedrock. Shops shifted worship from multiple gods to a lone solar disk, leaving priests out of work and temples echoing emptiness as if half the city decided to ghost on a long holiday. Historians still argue whether Akhenaten's monotheism collapsed to the New Kingdom or whether systemic drought and imperial overstretch were the true culprits in hushed corners. You hear a fringe claim that Akhenaten believed the Aten was an alien deity beamed from the stars, prompting him to fabricate proto-UFO hieroglyphs on temple walls. You wrinkle your nose, picturing scarab-encrusted ray beams and an extraterrestrial cameo in tomb paintings. It's hard to know if any pharaoh ever purchased interstellar real estate, but the image lingers. Cosmic overlord meets royal hype man. 3 jokes flicker in your mind. If you think your Zoom call glitches are bad, imagine an alien god buffering Nirvana. If your screensaver updates too slow, consider carving UFO murals in stone. And if your neighbor rails on about Area 51, tell them the Egyptians started streaming alien documentaries in 1350 BCE, drifting westward. You arrive at the Palatine Hill, under the reign of Commodus, in 192 CE. The emperor struts through guild halls, wearing a lion's skin, declaring himself reincarnated Hercules while Rome's foundations creak. His assassination by court conspirators is a mainstream turning point. Once the Praetorian Guards stabbed him in his bath, the empire spiraled into the year of the 5 emperors, each new ruler arriving with half-packed bags. Historians still argue whether Commodus's capricious cruelty or chronic economic malaise did more to accelerate Rome's decline. But his murder certainly kicked off a chain reaction. One fringe anecdote asserts Commodus bathed in pomegranate juice to absorb divine vigor and flung poisoned hibiscus blossoms at perceived traitors. You smirk at the image of the emperor twitching under fruit-scented steam, ordering, "Bring me more hibiscus, or someone's getting diced." It's a quirky legend that whispers of decadent impulse meeting lethal mischief. You almost picture a palace perfume line, Herculean night now, with extra sting. Further south, you glimpse Atahualpa's golden palace in Cajamarca, where the Inca ruler greets Pizarro's small band in 1532 CE that encounter Atahualpa's capture amid a ceremonial feast is a mainstream fact marking the swift fall of Tawantinsuyo's political core. Within days, the empire's unity splintered as nobles debated whether to ransom the Sapa Inca with roomfuls of gold or rally armies from distant provinces. Historians still argue whether Inca disunity or superior Spanish weaponry sealed the empire's fate, but the image of a ruler trading freedom for bullion remains iconic. Local fringe narrative claims Atahualpa's court used coca leaf divination to misread omens, interpreting a flock of Andean gulls as friendly guests instead of a warning sign. You grin at how a sacred leaf scooped from mountain caves could twist prophecy into misprophecy. It's a humble reminder that even diviners can have bad data. 3 light jokes float in your mind. If your weather app ever lies to you, at least it won't cost your kingdom. If your coffee shop's loyalty card glitches, spare a thought for empire-wide misreads. And if your GPS ever misroutes you, imagine dispatching armies down the wrong mountain pass. You drift along corridors of fallen sultans and exiled nobles. Sensing a pattern, leaders enthroned on divine right topple through human flaw ambition, outpacing prudence. Conspiracies outnumbering guards. Secrets whispered behind silken tapestries can carry more weight than bronze gates. You breathe in the stale perfume of court intrigue. Rosewater mingled with sweat, gold dust dancing in dim torchlight. Each overturned throne you past tastes of both hubris and betrayal. Amid these royal tumbles, you notice small sparks of mercy. One Hittite queen sheltered orphaned priestesses despite her husband's execution. One Egyptian scribe quietly preserved Amon's hymns beneath layers of rubble. A Roman senator penned admonitions against cruelty in the new ruler's ears. These acts remind you that leadership isn't just about crowns and conspiracies. It's about whether someone steps forward to mend what the powerful shred. You pause in a moonlit hall where fallen dynasties converge like ghosts at a silent reunion. The stone floor still bears scorch marks from sacrificial fires and dagger strikes. And you taste faint copper on your tongue, phantom blood or rust. You can't tell. Your heart races as you realize that, while nature's fury tests societies, it's human folly perched on thrones that often delivers the final blow. 3 final jokes drift through your mind. If you think office politics are brutal, imagine losing your job because someone omitted your name from a divine sanction. If your group projects devolve into blame games, at least they don't end in secret assassinations. And if your team's Zoom meeting crashes, be grateful it won't spark civil war. You tuck those wry thoughts into your cloak as you step away from the silent grandeur of palace ruins. Senses buzzing with the echoes of plotted betrayals and misguided monarchs. Ahead lies the migration of displaced peoples in Section 14, another chapter in civilization's grand unraveling. Spun by the same forces of power, ambition, and human frailty. Your pulse steadies, ready for the next journey across lands reshaped by both nature's hand and humankind's ambition. You slip into a twilight of dust-choked roads where the horizon brims with ragged columns of humanity, families trudging beside battered wagons. Children clutching bundles of threadbare blankets. The air tastes of peat smoke and stale sweat. A pungent reminder that movement itself can become a visceral struggle. You pass a cluster of refugees huddled around a flickering hearth carved from overturned pottery shards. And you realize migration isn't just a line on a map, just the smell of uprooted homes and the crackle of hopes. Rekindled in foreign lands, around 376 CE. You find yourself on the Danube's banks, watching Gothic families spill across Rome's frontier to escape the oncoming Huns. That massive influx is a mainstream historical fact, recorded by chroniclers who noted over 200,000 Goths entering imperial territory, sowing the seeds for the Visigothic sack of Rome in 410 CE. You shiver at the memory. Once they're inside, they bring both skilled artisans and restless warriors. Historians still argue whether this mass migration weakened the Western Empire more than internal corruption or economic collapse by the river's edge. You smell wet hides as refugees tan goatskins to patch torn tunics, a fringed tale claims. The Goths borrowed a trick from Scythian nomads, strapping ostrich feathers to their helmets, believing the plumes would summon wind spirits to guide their journeys. Can't help but grin at the mental image of feathered warriors plodding toward Pannonia, thinking if only these hats could fly us over the next mountain pass. Whether any Goth ever braved alpine breezes in such headgear is doubtful. But the story lingers in campfire gossip like a flickering shadow. You trudge along muddy tracks and crest a ridge to see a Roman garrison's remains, stumbled walls strewn with broken amphorae. Local farmers who once tilled these fields now stand as reluctant hosts, offering grain rations in exchange for labor repairing dikes and filling roofless baths. You inhale the sour tang of fermented barley, mingling with livestock, dung, and imagine modern aid workers organizing refugee quotas only. Here the ledger is scratched on bark and enforced by soldiers with spear tips. 3 light jokes surface. If you grumble about bureaucratic delays, spare a thought for refugees waiting decades for land allotments. If your office coffee's weak, these camps serve barley gruel that could strip paint. And if your commute's long, imagine trudging 500 miles with a goat strapped to your back as dusk falls. You follow lantern glow into a makeshift Gothic village. You taste smoke-tainted stew simmering in a rusty cauldron and overhear leaders debating settlement terms. One Gothic chieftain demands joint ownership of local watermills. Nearby Roman elders plead for peace and promise tax exemptions. You imagine modern town hall meetings where language barriers and legal codes twist every word. Historians still argue whether these negotiated foederati agreements fostered cooperation or merely bridged the gap until conflict flared again. You wander through narrow lanes where wooden huts share courtyard walls with crumbling Roman villas. A young Goth girl sits carving rune-like symbols on a repurposed marble slab, her shorthand for prayers she can't otherwise inscribe. That blending of traditions speaks of cultural friction and fusion. Artisans teach locals Germanic braiding techniques for horse harnesses, while Goths learn Roman clay mold casting for roof tiles. You sniff the wet earth, taste the uncanny sweetness of shared innovation, and recall the pottery wheel you admired in Section Tune, now turning by Gothic hands. Further west, you trace the Vandals' march through Gaul into Spain and across the Strait of Gibraltar to North Africa around 429 CEU. Feel the tremor of hooves on loose rock, a fury of red ponies kicking up ochre dust. That daring crossing is a mainstream insight. Within a decade, the Vandals establish a kingdom in Carthage, seizing grain fleets and reorienting Mediterranean trade routes. You taste salt on your tongue as breezes off the sea swirl with the scent of citrus groves, a sharp contrast to cooling Danubian marshes. A quirky tidbit floats from Vandal campfires. Some warriors fashioned makeshift horse gates by binding animal bones to their mounts' hooves, believing the contraptions sped them across slick river fords. You chuckle imagining Vandal cavalry skidding comically into shallows. Hold on, I need traction here. Whether these bone boots ever rode more than a dozen yards is uncertain. But the tale underscores how migrants tinkered to survive unfamiliar environments. You press onward to witness Anglo-Saxon settlement in post-Roman Britain around 450 CE. The miscloaked fen country tastes like damp peat and seaweed as you step from a coracle onto mossy turf. Migrant warbands set up timber halls, intermarrying with Celts and forging new kinship networks. That demographic shift is a mainstream fact, evidenced by genetic studies showing Norse and Saxon markers in modern English populations. You run your hand over reed-thatched walls, dripping with dew, and think of Facebook ancestry tests solely here. Lineage is etched in rune-strewn gravestones and oral pedigrees handed down by bards. A fringe rumor circulates that some Saxon settlers carried trunk-sized magic stones stolen from British hill forts, nicknaming them Giant's Dice and tossing them in tournaments to prove strength. You grin at the thought of burly warriors heaving megaliths like cosmic shot puts. Watch me roll these cursed board game pieces. It's an improbable image, but such legends kept warrior prestige alive amid damp fields. You pause at the threshold of a ruined stone church where Anglo-Celtic congregations once gathered. The interior smells of moss and chipped lime plaster. Faint music of dual-language hymns still hums in the mortared arches. You overhear scribes glossing Latin sermons into Old English, and you see how faith becomes a bridge for newcomers and natives alike. Historians still argue whether religious conversion eased integration or masked deeper ethnic tensions. Shifting continents, caused to the Bantu migrations in Africa around 1000 BCE to 500 CE. You wander through equatorial forests where pioneer farmers clear bush with slash-and-burn techniques. The air tastes green and earthy, thick with the perfume of ripe plantains. Bantu-speaking peoples introduce iron tools and yams to new territories, a mainstream fact traced through linguistic maps and archaeological sites. You imagine modern diaspora communities celebrating homecoming festivals, ancient farmers marking each new frontier with communal feasts. A fringe snippet murmurs that some Bantu clans carved walking staffs laced with beeswax, believing honeybees taped to the handles would deter hostile wildlife. You wince at the chaos of startled apes and buzzing vines, early eco-security prototypes. Perhaps Whether bees ever guarded caravans or simply stung unsuspecting travelers is anyone's guess. But it's a testament to migrants' inventive defenses. You follow coastal sands to the Polynesian expansion across the Pacific between 1000 BCE and 1000 CE. You feel fine coral powder underfoot and taste briny sea breeze. Canoes hewn from giant trees ride swells toward uncharted atolls. That navigational feat is a mainstream marvel gleaned from star charts and ocean current studies. The Polynesians' peopled islands scattered across thousands of miles. You sniff the salty air and imagine modern GPS engineers studying voyaging stars as their ultimate ancestors did. 3 light jokes trickle in. If your smartphone maps lead you astray, be thankful you're not relying on star scrying. Your kayak tips. Spare a thought for outriggers lost at sea. And if your baggage gets lost, think of ancient voyagers with only a gird bird as luggage. You stand atop a sand dune, surveying the swirling mosaic of migrant communities: Goths in Galatia, Vandals in Carthage, Saxons in East Anglia, Bantu in the rainforest, Polynesians on coral atolls. Each group arrives with burdens and opportunities. Strained host resources, cultural exchanges, hybrid traditions. You taste the mingled aroma of cooking fires, peppered goat stew, cassava porridge, roasted breadfruit, a culinary testament to shared journeys. By nightfall, lanterns wink across frontiers. You glimpse Gothic smiths forging hybrid swords with Roman metallurgy, Vandal merchants attending Carthaginian markets, Saxon weavers blending Celtic patterns, Bantu potters painting Zulu motifs, Polynesian navigators trading shell necklaces. You inhale the smoke from 5 different hearths, each carrying flickers of origin and adaptation. It's a living tapestry of displacement and belonging. You remember goat dung sunscreens, questionable SPF, and ostrich-feathered Goth helmets, snailing scribbles, safeguarding songs, feathered Sea Raider hay pats, and the idiosyncratic bone skates. All are echoes of migrants striving to survive and maintain identity. Migration reshapes landscapes and minds, forging new societies from the crucible of movement. And as the lantern fires burn into the dusk, you sense that wherever people wander, whether fleeing Huns or seeking new shores, they carry the seeds of collapse and renewal in equal measure. You drift from those flickering lanterns of migrant camps into an open plain strewn with stone pillars and crumbling aqueduct arches. The air tinged with faint ozone and sun-baked limestone, beneath the shadow of a collapsed Roman viaduct. Same network that once spanned over 50,000 miles across the empire. You sense the hum of history crackling beneath your feet. That vast road system is a mainstream fact that stitched provinces together, enabling legions to march and merchants to trade as if the world were a single neighborhood. You breathe in dust stirred by evening winds and taste a hint of metal from rusted nails embedded in rotting wagon wheels. It's reminding you how infrastructure endures long after empires fade. As the sun dips, you wander past terraces of former rice paddies and Southeast Asian genius waterworks originally honed in China over 2 millennia ago. You feel droplets on your fingertip from a trickle of irrigation still fed by ancient channels. Historians still argue whether these early hydrological GRIDs spread southward via Indian Ocean traders or developed independently in deltas far removed from the Chinese heartland. Either way, the logic of sharing water remains as vital now as when first hewn by chisels nearby. An undersea sonar signature off a coastal reef sparks chatter among fringe divers claiming echoes of Atlantean columns lying 200 feet down. You smirk at the idea of shimmering capitals glittering on the seabed, selfie spot for scuba influencers. You joke silently, but you also admire how legends anchor coastal communities to a mythic past. 3 light jokes drift through your mind. If you miss your daily steps goal, imagine charging a Fitbit with tidal currents. If your Roomba gets stuck, be grateful it isn't a mosaic floor washed out by tsunamis. And if your coffee machine sputters, at least it runs on electricity, not aqueduct leaks. Walking toward the remains of a Mayan ceremonial plaza. You trace glyphs carved into lintels, corresponding calendars that once tracked solar cycles with astonishing precision. That astronomical mastery is a mainstream marvel. Maya astronomers predicted eclipses decades ahead, blending ritual with science. You taste the dusty sweetness of nearby ceiba blossoms and imagine ancient priests timing ceremonies by observing Venus's appearance. Historians still argue whether those calendar systems served purely ritual ends or also underpinned broader agricultural planning. You pause by a sunken well in a former Indus settlement. Dipping your palm into algae-flecked water, nearby fragments of painted pottery catch the last light patterns echoing those you saw in Section 12's mosaic collages. That artistic continuity underscores how aesthetic motifs travel. Circular spirals from Mohenjo-Daro resurface in Persian carpets centuries later. A quirky tidbit whispers that Indus artisans mixed ground conch shell into pigments, believing the shimmer repelled malevolent spirits. You chuckle at the notion of warding off demons with glitter. Drifting westward, you encounter a medieval scriptorium's vaulted ruins, where charred vellum pages lay scattered like autumn leaves. You taste the acrid residue of ink still lingering on half-legible Latin text sprayers. Land deeds, scribbled medicinal recipes. The concept of zero, first formalized in India around the 3rd century BCE, traveled through Arabic scholars into these very margins, revolutionizing mathematics. That transmission is a mainstream fact chronicled in Al-Khwarizmi's works, whose Arabic numerals now guide your phone's touchscreen keypad. You raise an eyebrow at your calculator app and think, all thanks to scribes copying dusty scrolls by candlelight. In a nearby courtyard, you notice a blending of iconography. A faded cross overlays, lion capital relief once symbolizing Mauryan rule in South Asia. That syncretism tells of successive empires repurposing symbols to legitimize power, much like Section 10's mixed pantheons in Alexandria. You smell damp moss creeping over crevices where once temple oil lamps burned bright. 3 jokes flicker. If your wallpaper app glitches, at least it doesn't merge Buddha and Zeus in a single icon. If your ringtone gets stuck, spare a thought for monks chanting from palimpsests. And if your Zoom background warps, imagine your medieval fresco arbitrarily refaced by invading troops. Night deepens as you drift across the Andes foothills where stone Inca terraces cling to hillsides. You feel the rough basalt underfoot and taste the sweet tang of chicha fermenting in hollowed gourds. That terracing method is a mainstream marvel of pre-Columbian engineering, preserving soil and channeling mountain runoff. Historians still argue whether these systems evolved locally or spread via earlier Andean cultures like the Wari. But the outcome remains that modern farmers still harvest maize on those same slopes across the Pacific. You stand on a windswept Polynesian atoll under a blanket of stars. You sense the faint salt spray on your lips and recall those Sea Lord navigators who read wind patterns and bird flight to sail thousands of miles without instruments. That navigational skill is a mainstream testament to human ingenuity, instituted long before compasses or GPS. A fringe rumor persists that Polynesian priests inscribe star maps on coconut leaf tablets only legible during full moon low tides. You grin at the practical challenge of consulting tidal star charts. Hope the moon's in phase, or you're stuck on a reef. As you circle back toward the Mediterranean, you pass a modern olive grove, whose gnarled trees trace back to grafted cuttings from Bronze Age groves in Crete. You press your nose to a weathered trunk and smell fruity bitterness steeped in millennia of cultivation. The continuity of crop strains is a mainstream fact confirmed by genetic analysis showing Cretan olive DNA in today's harvests. You imagine sharing a bruschetta flavored by olives whose ancestors braved Tharus ash and Mycenaean decline. You wander into a present-day market stall selling linen textiles patterned in Phoenician motifs copied from Carthaginian amphory. That design persistence honors Section 2's River Valley innovations and Section 12's Mosaic revivals. You taste a sample of locally smoked fish, an echo of ancient Mediterranean trade in garum and salted anchovies. 3 final jokes surface. If your artisanal soap seems overpriced, remember it descends from Babylonian perfumers. If your artisanal bread has seeds, spare a thought for Neolithic farmers drafting grain tides. And if your kombucha fizz disappoints, least it isn't calcium spoil water from a collapsed canal. You stop beside a broken sundial, atop a marble plinth. Its moonlight crests the horizon. Its faint shadow reminds you time itself bends to human invention. If you recall the water clock from Section 6, the celestial omens of Section 13, and the clay tablets of Section 12, all markers of how knowledge endures and fades. Historians still argue whether these relics survive by chance or conscious preservation. But you feel the weight of collective memory pressing in gentle waves. Taking a final breath of salt, ash, and wild herbs, you sense that vanished civilizations haven't vanished entirely. They echo in languages, building techniques, crops, art, and stories passed down across generations. You tuck those echoes into your heart like relic shards, knowing they'll shimmer when you least expect them. The tapestry you've traversed from river valleys and drought-tracked, Ailed's 2 mingled fades and nomadic trails unfurls before you in the cool night air. A reminder that every collapsed city leaves seeds for future growth. Asterisk night's hush deepens as you recline on a low stone bench. Your body warmed by lingering sun on the weathered marble. Each breath carries a softer rhythm, and your mind drifts through the centuries you've traversed. The crash of distant waves, once a clarion of trade and invasion, now melds into a lullaby of timeless continuity. You feel the weight of history lift like curtains from a silent stage. Let the scents of olive groves, damp vellum, and sea spray fade gently behind your eyelids. Imagine those ancient roads beneath your feet transforming into veins of starlight, guiding spirits home. Every collapsed temple, every cracked aqueduct, holds within it the promise of renewal like seeds scattered on fertile soil. Civilizations may vanish, but their echoes are woven into our songs, our gardens, and our shared dreams. Rest in the knowledge that human ingenuity and compassion endure in quiet acts. A farmer tending terraces first carved 3 millennia ago. A storyteller passing whispered legends through candlelit rooms. A sailor tracing star paths learned from ancestors centuries before compasses existed. These small continuities outlast empires, forging bonds across time. Now, soft as a whisper. Release all weight from your shoulders. Let the sigh of wind through broken columns become a gentle promise. As your lids grow heavy, allow history's chorus to lull you each. Echo a note in the vast melody of humankind. Hush, drift into this calm, knowing that every dawn brings new possibilities. Built on yesterday's foundations. End of script. Sweet dreams.